On a narrow street in the old town, where small houses hid in the shade of green trees, the artist Edward, a black man with a dream of creating beautiful art, was immersed in his creativity. He was kneeling, carefully putting the finishing touches on the canvas, when footsteps were heard from around the corner. Jake, a local known for his hostility towards people of other races, said loudly. His eyes flashed with aggression when he saw Edward immersed in his work. Edward looked up, but before he could say anything, Jake suddenly stepped forward and grabbed him by the collar. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed, spitting out words full of hatred. "People like you are the only thing that gets in the way of this city." Edward's heart began to beat faster. Fear gripped him, but another emotion was also boiling in his chest: helplessness. People had gathered around him, and there was a tension in the air, as if the whole world had frozen, waiting to see how it would end. "Get out," Jake said, and there was a threat in his voice. Edward felt a cold sweat running down his back. He knew he couldn't answer, it could end badly. But suddenly something inside him ignited. He raised the canvas, showing everyone what he was creating. "I am an artist," he said quietly but confidently. "I am here to show beauty, not hate." Jake took a step back, but his hatred only grew. He tried to act, and at that moment Edward felt the world around him begin to spin. It was as if everything had paused. The screams, the puzzled looks, everything was mixed up in chaos. When Edward felt the impact, his mind was filled not only with fear, but also with deep sadness. He could not understand how hatred could cloud the mind. Edward gathered himself and met the gaze of those around him. This was not just a random occurrence. This was a moment that would make everyone think. "Write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from," he said, catching his breath a little. "Your words are important to me, and they help us move forward. Each of you is part of our path to understanding and love, which are so necessary in our world." Silence enveloped everyone, and everyone understood. Hatred can lead to a fall, but only love and understanding can lift one up. The silence that followed Edward's words seemed fragile. Passers-by looked at them, but no one dared to intervene. Jake, still dissatisfied, clenched his fists and his breathing became heavy, as if he was having difficulty controlling his emotions. "You think your paints can make a difference?" he said sharply, looking at Edward with displeasure. "This is not what we need." Edward felt the excitement building in his chest. His hands were shaking slightly, but he clenched his teeth, trying not to show weakness. This was not just a casual conflict. It was a clash of different views, experiences, and misunderstandings. "I paint to create, not to destroy," he replied, trying to remain calm. "Art should unite people, not divide them." "Unite?" Jake chuckled, a challenge in his voice. "You don't understand that we all want to save our world. It's scary." The assembled spectators began to whisper, but no one dared to intervene. Edward felt the tension in the air. "Hate won't make us stronger," he said, trying to reach Jake. "We're all human. We have our own dreams and hopes." Jake stepped closer, his face turning serious. "I just see everything changing around me. It can be difficult," he said doubtfully. "I don't want it to affect my world." Edward looked into Jake's eyes and saw that there was not only anger there, but also uncertainty. It was fear of the unfamiliar. "I am not the enemy," Edward said, trying to get his point across. "I am here to create, not destroy." But Jake wasn't going to listen. He suddenly stepped forward and touched Edward's shoulder with a light touch. "You don't understand," he said, his voice softening slightly. "All of this is changing our reality." Edward raised himself up on his elbows, breathing heavily. His mind was filled with mixed feelings, uncertainty and hope. He knew that this wasn't just about him, but about the importance of finding common ground. "You can't go on like this," he said to the audience, feeling his voice grow stronger. "We need to learn to understand each other, not conflict." But all he heard in response was silence. Edward looked at Jake and noticed that there was not only irritation in his eyes, but also confusion. It was not hatred, but simply fear of change. "I want us to be able to work together," Edward said, trying to put all his sincerity into his words. "Art can unite, if we allow it to do so." These words hung in the air, like a quiet hope in a stormy sea of misunderstanding. But what happens next when the question of a shared future is still open? The next morning, Edward woke up feeling uncertain. The events of the previous day were still swirling around in his head. He remembered Jake's face, his anger and fear. Edward knew that this conflict would not end in one meeting, and he needed to find a way to get his ideas across. After breakfast, he decided to go to the park, a place where he often painted. It was full of life and inspiration. This time, Edward brought not only paints, but also a notebook in which he wrote down his thoughts. He wanted to create something more than just a picture. He wanted to create a dialogue. The park was full of people, families, students, elderly couples. Edward chose a quiet corner under a spreading tree and began to draw. Each stroke was an attempt to express his feelings and thoughts about the world. He wanted to show the beauty of diversity and unity. Jake was peeking out from behind a nearby tree, a disgruntled expression on his face and a cell phone in his hand. Edward felt his heart pounding. "You're here again?" Jake said, coming closer. There was no anger in his voice, more of a challenge. "Yes, I'm here," Edward replied, trying to speak calmly. "I draw to get my thoughts across." Jake said mockingly, "People don't want to listen. They want to see things stay the same." Edward knew that Jake was still under the influence of yesterday's emotions, and this could be a chance to talk to him. "Maybe, but I believe that art can change attitudes. We can do something together if we want to," he said, looking up at Jake. Jake paused, and for a moment his face softened. "I don't know," he said, as if to himself. "Everyone around me says it's impossible." "And you?" Edward asked. "Do you believe it?" There was a moment of silence between them. Jake looked at the painting Edward had just begun. He saw the vibrant colors, the intertwining lines, symbols of hope and unity. "Maybe I'm just tired of fighting," he said quietly. Edward felt that this was a good sign. He knew that talking openly with Jake could be the start of something new. "Let's talk. Maybe you can explain what exactly is bothering you," he suggested. But before Jake could answer, a sound rang through the air that interrupted their conversation. A teenager with an aggressive expression on his face jumped out of the crowd. He threw something at Edward, who jumped aside without expecting it. "You think you're the smartest one here?" the teenager shouted, causing discontent among those around him. "Put away your paints and go back where you came from." Edward froze, feeling everything around him heating up. Jake seemed puzzled. "Stop!" he cried, trying to stop the situation. "You don't understand what he's talking about." But the teenager only grinned, preparing for the next attack. Edward knew that their conversation could turn into something much more serious. How would the bystanders react? Would they defend Edward or just watch? And what would happen to Jake if he sided with him? Edward knew this was just the beginning. The situation in the park was heating up. Edward, feeling the adrenaline rushing through his veins, looked at Jake, who also didn't know what to do. "Get out of the way if you don't want to get punched in the face," the teenager shouted, his face contorted with anger. Edward instinctively took a step back, but Jake, to his surprise, stepped between him and the aggressor. "You can't just attack a guy," Jake said, trying to calm the situation. "He didn't do anything wrong. He's here because he doesn't care about us," the teenager blurted out, his voice shaking with rage. "We have to protect our world from people like him." Edward felt his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that this hatred was not personal, but the result of accumulated resentment and fear. "Listen," Edward said, turning to the teenager. "I'm here to share my art, to speak of unity and understanding. I'm not the enemy." The teenager just grinned. "Unity? You're just trying to outshine us with your paintings. You don't know what it's like to be us." Jake turned to Edward. "Maybe he's right," he said, looking thoughtfully at the teenager. "You don't understand what it means to live in our world. Everything around us is changing, and it scares people." "I understand," Edward said, sensing that this was his chance. "I'm not here to impose my ideas. I want to understand what's bothering you. We all have problems, and that's okay, but hatred won't solve the problem." "Hate?" the teenager asked, his voice calmer. "You don't know what it is. I see my friends suffering because of what's happening. How can you not understand?" Edward felt the wall that had been built between them begin to crack. "I understand that you have fear," he said, "but maybe instead of arguing, we should discuss it together. There's nothing wrong with that." "Discuss?" the teenager exclaimed, but now there was weariness in his voice. "We've already tried that, and nothing changes." Jake added, "Everyone thinks they can just push the problem away instead of talking about it. Hate doesn't solve problems, it only makes them worse." Edward noticed the tension in the air begin to ease, but fear still hung around him. He decided to continue. Let's start with small steps. I can show how art can be a bridge, not a barrier. Together we can create something that will show everyone that there is another way. The teenager lowered his head slightly, his anger beginning to fade. You may be right, he said quietly, but it will be difficult. People don't want to listen. They want to see everything stay the same. I'm ready to help, Edward replied, feeling hope ignite inside him. Let's try to change this together. At that moment, one of the passers-by, who had been watching everything that was happening, came closer. You know, I feel like something needs to change, too, he said, looking around the crowd. We can't just stay in the shadows. Let's support this idea. Everyone turned to look at him, and although not everyone agreed, there was a glimmer of unity in the air. Edward felt the tension slowly fading. The situation in the park began to change. Edward, who felt the tension gradually fading, noticed that some of those around him began to come closer. Although opinions were divided, the desire to talk and discuss was palpable. Maybe it really is possible, Jake said, still standing between Edward and the teenager. His voice was no longer as aggressive as before, but rather had a note of interest. I believe that together we can create something important, Edward said, addressing the group. Art can be a force that unites, not divides. The teenager, who was initially against it, thought for a moment. But what can we do? People don't want to listen. They don't want to see. We can start simple, Edward suggested. Let's organize an exhibition where everyone can express their feelings through art. We can create a space for dialogue. An exhibition? Jake asked, raising an eyebrow. That might work, but who's going to come? If we talk about it openly, if we offer people the opportunity to participate, I'm sure they'll respond, Edward replied. This could be a chance for everyone. The group began to discuss the details, and Edward felt his words begin to resonate. Even the teenager who had previously been challenging now looked thoughtful. I can help with the organization, he said, looking at Jake. If you don't mind, I can tell my friends. I can join in, too, Jake added, realizing that this idea might change his own outlook on things. If one of us is willing, maybe the others will be understanding, too. Edward felt hope flare up inside him. Maybe this really was the first step to something bigger. A few days later, they met again to discuss the details of the exhibition. Edward proposed to collect different works, paintings, photographs, even poetry. Each piece was to reflect feelings and experiences related to the theme of unity and difference. The main thing is that everyone is ready to talk openly about their experiences, Edward said, looking at the crowd. This is not just an exhibition. This is an opportunity to create a space for understanding. Some of the participants, still doubtful, began to ask questions. And if someone disagrees with our opinion, the girl asked, her voice trembling with excitement. That's okay, Edward replied. The main thing is that everyone can speak out. We must learn to listen to each other, even if our opinions differ. Gradually, the preparation process began. They organized meetings where people could discuss their ideas and share their work. Edward noticed how some participants, initially skeptical, began to open up and share their stories. However, there was still uncertainty in the air. Edward felt that not everyone would accept this idea. There were those who would prefer to maintain the old order and stay in their comfort zone. He knew that real change takes time and patience. The day of the exhibition arrived. Edward was excitedly preparing for the event. He chose one of his most significant paintings, an image of hands reaching out to each other, surrounded by flowers and symbols of different cultures. As the doors opened, he saw people starting to gather. The crowd included old acquaintances and new faces. Some came with prejudice, others with open hearts. Edward knew this was only the beginning. But at that moment he noticed Jake, who was looking at him with concern. Are you ready? He asked, his voice tense. Yes, Edward replied, though doubts still raged inside him. But don't forget, this isn't just about us. It's about showing others that we can live in a world where each other is heard and understood. But as they entered the room, Edward noticed someone whispering in the corner. A group of people, clearly unhappy, were exchanging glances. Edward felt his heart skip a beat. Was this going to cause a conflict? How would they react to their ideas? The exhibition hall was full of people. The atmosphere was a mixture of excitement and anticipation. Edward felt the tension rising as his gaze fell again on the group standing in the corner. They were whispering and casting disgruntled glances at the works on display. "Who is it?" Jake asked quietly, noticing Edward looking in their direction. "I'm not sure," Edward replied, trying to remain calm, but they don't seem to be in a positive mood. The group of people, mostly teenagers and young adults, looked distinctly out of sorts. One of them, a tall guy with tattoos, stepped forward, heading toward Edward. "Is this your exhibition?" he asked with a defiant grin. His voice was full of contempt. "Yes," Edward replied, trying to sound confident. "We want to discuss important topics and learn to understand each other." "Understand?" the guy asked again. "Do you really think these paintings will change anything? Our life is not art." Edward felt his heart pounding. "Art is something that can inspire," he replied. "It helps people see the world from a different perspective." "It's just paint on a canvas," another guy in the group shouted. "You don't know what you're talking about. No amount of paint will change our reality." Edward, feeling the need to defend his ideas, stepped forward. "But if we don't talk about it, we will remain in the shadow of hatred and misunderstanding," he said. "We must start a dialogue." "Dialogue?" the tall guy responded, his voice becoming more sullen. "Why? So you can impose your ideas? That's not what you're here for." A small crowd had gathered around and the tension was growing. Edward saw Jake look confused, but then he stood next to him. "I support Edward," he said, his voice firm. "We're all here to share our stories. We're not the enemy, and no one should feel that way." The group of boys exchanged glances, but their tension did not ease. "How can you talk about unity when you are actually divided?" one of them said. "You are only here to show how good you are." Jake snapped, "But if you don't want to hear, that's your problem." Edward felt a fire burning in his chest. He didn't want this conflict to escalate into something more. "I don't want to fight," he said, turning to the group. "I want to know what's bothering you. If we don't talk, nothing will change." At this point, the tall guy seemed to think. His face softened, but there were still those around him who were not going to give up. "Okay," he said, shaking his head slightly. "We may not agree with you, but we're not going to sit back and let you ruin everything." Edward understood that this conversation was just the beginning. "I'm not trying to ruin anything," he said. "I just want us to try to understand each other." The group began to discuss among themselves, but Edward noticed that some of them were slowly moving away. They were not ready to accept his words. It was weighing on him. "If you don't want to talk," he said, "that's your decision, but I believe that art can help us change this world." At that moment a voice came from behind. "The exhibition is good, but let's be honest, not everyone will agree with you," said one of the spectators who had joined them. "Some people just don't want to hear it." Edward knew this was true. Real change takes effort, and he knew he had to keep fighting for his ideas. "I'm ready for this," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We can create space for everyone, but it's up to each of us." Meanwhile, the group standing in the corner began to discuss among themselves, and their mood changed. Edward felt that their position might waver, and this could be a turning point. But what would happen next? Would they be willing to engage in dialogue, or would they continue to stand their ground? Edward knew that this evening could be the start of something new, but he also knew that it would take more than just a desire. Edward stood in the center of the room, feeling the tension in the air, his heart pounding in time with every word. People were gathering around him, and every minute was becoming more and more crucial. "We can start by saying that we are here to exchange views," he said, looking at the group standing in the corner. "Let's share our stories and what concerns us." The tall guy with tattoos shook his head. "It's easy for you to talk about dialogue when you don't have any real problems," he said. "You don't understand what it's like to grow up in this world where you always have hatred for someone." "I don't claim to know what it's like," Edward replied, "but I'm here to learn and to listen. I want to understand what you're going through." Jake, feeling the need to support his friend, added, "We are all different, but we must be ready to work together. This does not mean that we agree on everything, but dialogue can help us understand each other better." Some in the crowd began to nod, seeming to open up. Edward continued, building on their interests. "For example, you can tell me what worries you the most. I want you to share your experiences. It can help us all." Suddenly, one of the group members, who had a serious expression on his face, stepped forward. I grew up in a neighborhood where we were always taught to hate. I see my friends suffering and it makes me angry. I just want to protect what we have, he said, his voice shaking with emotion. I understand that you feel fear and anger, Edward replied, his voice soft and sincere. That's perfectly normal, but hatred won't solve your problems. It only makes them worse. Let's find ways to protect each other, not divide each other. The tall boy opened his mouth again, but instead of speaking, he only took a deep breath. He seemed to be thinking about Edward's words. Maybe you're right, he said finally, but it's hard. It's hard for me to see things changing when so many people out there are against us. I get that, too, Jake said, but that's why we need to come together. Together, we can make a difference. If you want your stories heard, let's do it together. The group began to exchange glances, and Edward noticed that some of them were beginning to relax their defensive stances. Their faces were no longer filled with hatred. Instead, they were seeking understanding. We can't just leave this to chance, one of the group members said. If you really want to help, we need more than just an exhibition. We need action. I'm ready to work with you, Edward replied. We can create not only an exhibition, but also programs that will help people learn more about each other. The crowd around them began to liven up. Conversations began to break out, and Edward felt a certain energy building. Okay, said the tall guy. We can try, but it has to be honest and open. Exactly, Edward agreed. Everyone needs to feel safe and be willing to share. This is an important step for all of us. A group began to form around them, and the conversations grew more intense. Every new word, every new opinion helped to break down the barriers that separated people. However, in this flow of communication, Edward suddenly noticed that one of the women in the crowd, standing a little to the side, was still tense. Her eyes expressed doubt, and this worried Edward. He understood that not everyone was ready to leave their fears behind. If anyone wants to talk but doesn't know how, he said, just know that we're here to listen. We have time. This simple phrase seemed to calm the atmosphere a little. The woman slowly stepped forward. I see what you're trying to do, she said, her voice shaking, but many of us still live with this hatred. It's hard to change. Edward nodded. Knowing it was true, hatred was often driven by fear, and that fear didn't go away instantly. I'm here to help, he said. We can all do this. Let's learn from each other to create a future where we can live in peace. The assembled group began exchanging glances, and Edward felt that something new had begun. The conversations were becoming more and more sincere, and this gave him strength. However, there was still a shadow of tension. Not everyone was ready to open up, and the question hung in the air: would they be able to overcome this barrier? The crowd continued to gather around Edward and Jake, and the conversations gradually turned into exchanges of opinions and stories. Everyone shared their experiences, and everyone wanted to be heard, but the shadow of mistrust still hung over the group, and Edward felt that he needed to continue to work on creating an atmosphere of trust. We're all here for different reasons, he began, trying to establish a connection. Everyone has their own story, but together, we can build something bigger than just an exhibition. What do you think we can build? Asked the woman, still standing to the side. Her voice was full of skepticism. Words won't change anything. Edward, without losing his composure, said, words can be the beginning of change. If we don't talk about our fears and experiences, we will never understand each other. Let's try to create a platform where everyone can speak out and be heard. But how are you going to do that? Asked the tall guy, who was already showing interest in the conversation. We don't have time for chatter. We could set up regular meetings, Edward suggested, a place where we can share our stories, discuss what's bothering us, and find solutions. And what? You think this will change anything? Another member of the group chuckled. People just don't want to listen. But if we're open, Jake said, maybe someone will change their mind. Don't underestimate the power of communication. The crowd froze, and Edward noticed some nodding in agreement. He continued. For example, if someone talks about their experiences, it can open the eyes of others. We can see that hatred is often based on misunderstanding. I have a story, the woman who had been standing to the side suddenly said. Her voice became more confident. I grew up in a neighborhood where I was constantly told that people different from us were dangerous. I was a part of that, too. Everyone froze, listening to her. But when I went to study in another city, I encountered people about whom I had previously thought only badly. I saw that they had their own fears and worries, and this made me think about my prejudices. Edward nodded, feeling the tension build in the air. We can face our fears, he said. Each of us has the right to our own story, and each of us can change our perceptions if we are ready. It's easy to say, the tall guy intervened again, but hard to do. We all know what it's like to live under pressure. Yes, it is difficult, the woman agreed. But it is possible. I began to understand that each of us is not just a stereotype, but a person with dreams and fears. Edward felt the atmosphere begin to change. The words the woman spoke touched deeply. He saw how some people began to exchange glances, realizing that this was not just a conversation, but something more. Maybe we need to start small, Jake said. We can have small gatherings where everyone can tell their story. It will help us understand what others are going through. The crowd began to liven up, and Edward felt that they were moving in the right direction. Yes, let's do it, one of the men said. We have a lot of stories, and maybe someone will realize that we can all change our views. We can create support for each other, Jake added. Together, we can begin a journey of change that would be impossible alone. Edward felt hope growing in him. People started exchanging contacts, and this was the beginning of a new phase. Everyone understood that there was still much work ahead, but now they had a common goal. However, at that moment, one of the exhibitors who had previously been hostile stepped forward. His face was serious, and Edward noticed that he looked worried. I'm not going to join you, he said, his voice harsh. But I want to say that maybe this is a chance. But if any of you betray this cause, I will not forgive you. Edward felt the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders again. They had to act now, not just talk. The promise they had made at this exhibition had to be kept. They had to overcome not only barriers, but their own fears. The excitement in the room was at its peak. Edward felt not only fear but also determination taking hold of him. He knew this was a critical moment. If they couldn't find common ground, everything they had built could be destroyed. We're not going to betray this cause, he said, trying to sound confident. Each of us is here because we want change. But to do that, we need to trust each other. Trust? The same guy who had expressed dissatisfaction smirked. You don't trust us yourself. You don't know what we're capable of doing. I understand that you have concerns, Edward replied, trying to calm the atmosphere. But it is precisely at moments like these that we must be especially careful. If we are not open to each other, we will miss the chance for understanding. The woman who had shared her story earlier came closer. I agree with Edward, she said. We each carry our own wounds. But if we continue to stand on opposite sides, no one will win. The crowd froze and the tension became palpable. Edward noticed how the looks of some participants began to change, and this gave him hope. But how can you expect us all to be open when part of us considers us enemies? The boy intervened again. His voice sounded angry. We're here to change that, Jake said, trying to remain calm. We want to create a space where everyone can share their story and feel safe. The guy with the tattoos took a step back, his face full of doubt. Okay, I'll listen, he said, his voice softening slightly. But if you disappoint me, I won't keep quiet. Edward nodded, understanding that this was the condition. He sighed and looked back at the group. It will be a difficult path, but if we are all ready to work together, it can change our perception. It will not be just an exhibition, it will be a place where we can openly discuss what worries us. Some of the participants began to whisper, and Edward felt the uncertainty begin to dissipate. He continued to speak, encouraging them to open up. We can create groups where everyone can share their stories. We can create more than just a space for communication. We can build a community. However, at that moment a sharp voice was heard from the crowd. A community? What if that community is divided? A woman on the edge said, her voice filled with disbelief. We can't just ignore differences of opinion. Edward felt something stir inside him. He knew that not everyone would be ready to accept the changes. "Yes, we have differences," he replied. "But that doesn't mean we should remain in the shadow of hatred. I believe that dialogue can help overcome these differences. But for that we need to trust," the tall guy intervened. "And how can we trust if we have a past full of misunderstandings and hatred?" The comment hung in the air like a cold wind. Edward knew they had a choice: continue to escalate the tension or try to resolve it. "I can't change the past," he said, "but I can change the future. We can start with something simple, listening to each other." And at that moment, a crash was heard in the hall. Someone accidentally dropped the painting, and it shattered on the floor. Edward looked in horror at the shards of glass, realizing how quickly everything could fall apart. "This is symbolic," said one of the participants, picking up a shard. "We are all like this painting. We may be beautiful, but if we don't take care of each other, we will break." Edward felt the bitterness in the air. This could be a tipping point if they didn't pull themselves together. He stepped forward, looking at everyone. "Let's not break apart. Instead, let's pick up the pieces and create something new. We can be stronger than our fears." The assembled group began to exchange glances. It was a moment when fear and hope collided. Edward sensed that many of them were ready to take on the challenge. But at that moment, the guy with the tattoos, who had managed to provoke aggression, stepped forward again. "We can talk, but I still don't trust you," he said with fury in his voice. "And if you're not careful, this place will become a battlefield." Edward realized there was more at stake than just talk. Real change required action. Each of them had a choice to make. The incredible tension in the room reached its peak. Edward felt the anticipation of conflict in the air. All eyes were on the guy with tattoos, and it was like an explosive mixture ready to discharge. "I'm not going to sit back and listen to your sweet talk about peace," he said, his voice menacing. "We all know that hatred won't go away just because you want it to." The crowd went silent, and Edward felt something bubble in his chest. He knew this could become something more. "Do you want to fight?" he asked, trying to remain calm even though his inner voice was screaming for protection. "We are here to discuss, not to stir up trouble." "Yes, that's exactly it. You're just trying to escape reality," the guy replied, his eyes blazing with hatred. "Hatred exists, and you all know it." "Hate is not the solution," the woman interjected, trying to calm the situation. "We can change this, but only if we are open." "Who needs this?" The guy stepped forward, and his voice became even more aggressive. "These are just words that don't mean anything." Edward felt the adrenaline rush through his veins. He needed to stop this situation before it got out of hand. "You can't just talk about people like that," he said, looking the boy straight in the eye. "We all have our own story. We're not here to make fun of each other." The guy took a step back, but there was determination in his eyes. "If you're so brave, then show me how you're going to do it," he challenged. "You think these are just words? You don't know what we've been through." At that moment, the room fell silent. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. Edward felt his heart pounding in his chest, and there was a threat in the air. "I don't want this to end in a fight," he said, trying to sound as confident as possible. "That's not the path we've chosen." But at that moment someone from the crowd, apparently tired of talking, shouted, "We can't just sit and talk. We need to act." The screams continued and Edward felt fear and aggression begin to fill the space. It was like a storm about to break. "Are you really ready to destroy what you've only just begun to build?" he asked, feeling each word take effort. "We should be working to resolve our conflicts, not escalate them." The guy with the tattoos stepped forward, and at that moment the other members of the group gathered around him, supporting him. Edward felt that the whole situation was starting to get out of control. "We have to show who's boss," one of his supporters shouted, and this spurred the crowd on. "Let's do it!" The words were a challenge, and Edward knew that if they didn't calm the situation, it could lead to violence. He quickly glanced at Jake, who was also tense and ready for any outcome. "Enough!" Edward shouted, gathering his last strength. "We must not allow hatred to overshadow us. It will only deepen our differences." The crowd began to grow, and Edward felt the tension rising. He knew that some of them were ready for physical violence. He had no choice. "If any of you want to fight, let's do it for real," he said, looking the boy in the eyes. "But know that if that happens, you'll lose not only me, but but also what we started here." The tattooed guy froze, his eyes glittering, but the cheers around him only added fuel to the fire. "You're all just wasting your time," he said, his voice growing louder. "I'm not going to listen to your sweet words while my brothers suffer." Edward felt his anger rising. He knew he had to stop this. But how? He stepped closer to the boy, trying not to show his fear. "You can leave hatred behind," he said, "but to do so, you must make a choice. If you choose to fight, you will only destroy yourself." At this point the crowd began to get noisy, and Edward knew he only had a few moments to prevent a possible explosion. "If anyone here wants to be a real leader, they have to show that they can do more than just hate," he said, feeling his words resonate in some hearts. It was like a spark in a powder keg. Edward felt the tension become almost palpable. Everyone was waiting to see who would make the first move. Would he be able to stop this madness, or would it all end in destruction? The room was silent, heavy with only the sound of heartbeats. Edward stood at the center of attention, ready for whatever might happen at any moment. He knew that this moment would decide everything. If they failed to deal with the situation now, the consequences could be catastrophic. "Come on, show me you can stand behind your words," the tattooed guy shouted again, his voice a bolt from the blue. "You keep talking about change, but are you ready for it?" The crowd erupted in cheers. Some began to shout words of approval. Others began to express discontent. Everyone was on edge, and the tension was growing. "Edward, you have to do something," Jake shouted, coming closer. His face was tense. He knew the situation was getting out of control. "If we let hatred take over, we will simply lose everything," Edward said, his voice determined, but he knew it might not be enough. Suddenly, someone in the crowd threw a bottle and it shattered on the floor. It was like a signal for a real fight to start. People started pushing and shoving, and Edward felt his heart skip a beat. He knew that if he didn't intervene, this could all end in tragedy. "Enough!" he shouted, trying to drown out the noise. "If you want to fight, you have to fight the hatred inside you, not each other." The guy with the tattoos stepped closer, his face contorted with rage. "Do you think you can stop us? We are all tired of your talk. Enough words, we need action." Edward, feeling that time was running out, decided to take a chance. "If you want to take action, let's do it differently. Let's create something that will help our communities instead of tearing each other down. We can start a project that will help us all." The guy with the tattoos froze, his eyes sparkling. "And what is this project?" he asked, bowing his head. "Are you trying to reassure us?" "I want us to work together," Edward said, trying to create hope amidst the hatred. "We can create a program that will teach people to understand each other. You can be a part of it." "How are you going to do that if you can't even control your people?" The woman intervened again, her voice full of disbelief. It was like a slap in the face. Edward felt like every word was a challenge. He knew he had to show confidence now. "I will host this program. I will do everything in my power to show that hatred has no power if we unite." "But what if it becomes empty words again?" The guy with tattoos spoke up again, and there was a threat in his tone. The assembled group began to talk. The tension grew. Edward knew that time was running out. "We can decide this now," he said, looking into each participant's eyes. "If you want to fight, let me know. But if you want change, let's do it together." Suddenly someone from the crowd shouted, "What do you even know about wrestling?" And that was the spark. The guy with the tattoos pushed aside the people around him and stepped toward Edward. "You don't know what it's like to lose your friends, what it's like to see your life fall apart," he said, his voice full of anger. "You just look at us as an experiment, and you don't understand that this is life and death for us." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that if he couldn't calm the situation down, things could get out of control. "I don't want to see us fall back into hatred," he said, his voice becoming more determined. "We're all suffering. This is not a solution." The tattooed boy leaned towards him, their faces close. Edward could feel his breath, full of rage. "I'll be watching you," he said quietly, but with clear intent. "If you fail us, I won't sit idly by." The crowd began to roar, and Edward felt the tension reach a breaking point. Every member was ready for action. If he didn't calm them down, it could end in violence. "Let's all go out into the streets and decide what to do," he suggested, trying to take control of the situation. "If you really want change, let's show that we can do it together." and not with weapons in our hands. The tattooed guy took a step back, his face tense as he sought approval from his supporters. "Okay, but if you fail us, I won't forgive you," he said, his voice sounding like a threat. Edward knew this could be a turning point. He turned to the crowd, feeling all eyes on him. "We must choose the path that leads to understanding, not destruction. This is our chance." The assembled group began to mutter, and Edward, feeling the adrenaline rushing through his veins, knew that this was their last chance. Could he turn anger into hope, or would hatred take hold of them once more? The crowd continued to discuss Edward's words, frozen in anticipation. Nervous tension hung in the air, and each moment seemed to last an eternity. Edward knew that what was at stake now was not just a conversation, but the fate of their future together. "You all talk about hatred, but who's willing to step up?" he said, trying to keep the crowd's attention. "Let's talk about what we can do together to make a difference." The guy with the tattoos seemed on the verge of exploding, shifting from one foot to the other, his eyes sparkling with anger. "We can't just talk about change," he shouted. "We have to act, otherwise it's just empty talk." Edward moved closer, trying to make contact. "I understand your anger, but let's think about the consequences. If we start fighting, it will only lead to more violence. Let's try to find a solution that will help us all." "And how are you going to do that?" interrupted the woman standing next to the guy. "You don't even know what it's like to live under pressure." Edward felt his heart pounding. Every word was a challenge, and he knew he had to be careful. "I know I cannot fully understand your suffering, but I am here to listen," he said, his voice softening. "If you are willing to open your hearts, I am willing to listen." The tattooed guy suddenly closed his eyes, as if trying to collect his thoughts. His body was shaking with tension. "You don't understand," he said, opening his eyes. "We face hatred every day. I don't know if I can trust someone who doesn't know what fear is." "I'm not asking you to trust me right away," Edward said, looking at him. "I'm just suggesting that we start a conversation. We can try to understand each other." At this moment a voice came from the crowd again. "What if this conversation doesn't help? We'll still remain disunited." Edward noticed the other participants starting to whisper and realized that some of them were losing faith in the process. "I believe that if we are willing to listen, we can find common ground," he said, "but for that to happen, each of us must be willing to take a step forward." The guy with the tattoos leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "You can say all this, but if you can't show that you're on our side, I won't let you deceive us." Edward felt the blood pounding in his temples. He knew that now, more than ever, he needed to show determination. "I'm ready to show it," he said, his voice hardening. "I want you to know that my goal is not division, but unification. We are all suffering, and only together can we change it." And at that moment, a buzz was heard in the crowd again. "Maybe we should go out into the streets and protest," someone shouted. "Show that we won't give up." Edward felt his heart sink. The protest could be an opportunity for unification, or it could be the beginning of violence. "Yes, but protesting could lead to clashes that would only make things worse," he said, trying to get his point across. "We can achieve change peacefully." The crowd froze, and Edward saw some of the participants start to look at each other. He knew that now was the time for them to show unity. "If you want to protest, let's do it peacefully. Let's unite our voices and demands, not incite hatred." The guy with the tattoos seemed hesitant. Edward knew this was his chance. "This isn't just a fight for us. This is a fight for everyone who faces bias. We can create a platform that will help others understand us," he said, feeling hope begin to rise. And suddenly, as if by magic, some began to nod, their faces filled with hope. Edward knew that the situation was beginning to change, but they were still on the edge of the abyss. "We can combine our efforts and do something meaningful," he continued, "but it will require courage and a willingness to work together." The group began to discuss ideas, and Edward felt his anger slowly fading, giving way to hope. But at that moment, a scream rang out. "You are all traitors," one of the men shouted from the back rows. He stepped forward, his face distorted with rage. "You want to surrender? You want to destroy everything?" Edward felt the tension peak again. It was like two worlds colliding. Each was in its place, and the consequences could be fatal. "This is not a betrayal," he said, trying to get his point across. "This is an opportunity to change our future." The tattooed boy stepped forward again, his eyes blazing. Edward knew it was time for decisive action, and he had to do everything he could to stop the disaster. "We can't let hatred take over again," he said desperately. "Let's do this peacefully, or everything we've built will crumble in the blink of an eye." The crowd froze, and for a moment everything hung in the air. Everyone waited to see what the one who had become a symbol of hatred would do, and his decision would determine whether Edward would be able to save the situation or find himself in the very center of a turbulent storm. The crowd froze in anticipation, and the tension became almost palpable. Edward stood face to face with the boy, his heart pounding in his chest. Everyone knew that everything depended on this moment. "You think you can just settle this with words?" the boy asked, his voice menacing. "We're all here because we're tired of lies and pretense." "I understand how you feel," Edward said, trying to remain calm, "but hatred won't make us stronger. We can change this if we work together." The crowd began to whisper, and Edward noticed some of them throwing displeased glances. "How are you going to do that?" someone from the back row asked. "We don't have time to talk." "I propose that we create an initiative that will unite our voices," Edward continued, his voice becoming more confident. "Let's organize an event where people can share their stories. Let's give everyone a chance to be heard." The guy with the tattoos crossed his arms over his chest, his expression unmoving. "And what if it all ends in empty promises?" he said, and his words caused a wave of approving cries among his supporters. "We've heard this many times before." Edward felt fear begin to overcome him. He knew that this moment was critical. "If we don't try, we'll never know," he shouted, trying to be heard above the general noise. "Our hatred will only drive us apart." At that moment, someone in the crowd said, "We have been suffering for too long. Let's change this once and for all." The words of this man seemed to spur the others on. They began to discuss, raising their voices, and the atmosphere became tense to the limit. "Let's go out into the streets and show that we're not afraid," someone suggested, and the crowd began to roar again. Edward, feeling the situation getting out of control again, pulled himself together. "No!" he shouted. "We cannot resort to violence. We must act wisely." The guy with the tattoos stepped closer, his eyes flashing with fury. "You still don't understand. If we don't act now, someone else will take advantage of our weakness." Edward knew he had to act quickly to avoid a collision. "If you want to be heard, you must show that we are united," he said, trying to encourage the crowd. "Hate is not a solution. It is only the beginning of a new fight." The crowd began to whisper, and Edward noticed some of them nodding. He knew this was their chance. "Let's do something that shows that we are ready for change," he suggested. "We can organize a peaceful meeting where everyone can express their thoughts and feelings." The guy with the tattoos froze, his face wavering between anger and contemplation. "Okay, but only if you watch over it yourself," he said, his voice softer but still full of displeasure. "If you fail us, I will not forgive you." Edward nodded, feeling the tension slowly begin to ease. He knew they had a chance. "I promise I'll do everything I can to make it work. We're all here for change." There were cheers in the crowd. People started discussing how they could organize the event. Edward felt a wave of hope rising. But at that moment someone shouted again. "What if one of us doesn't agree with this? What if one of us still wants to fight?" Edward instantly remembered the possible risks that lay in wait for them at every step. "This is exactly what we must fight against," he said. "If someone disagrees, we must discuss it openly. Only then can we find a common language." The crowd froze, and Edward felt the pressure sinking in. He knew this was the key moment. If they couldn't pull together now, it could all be catastrophic. "We are all suffering," he said, "but hatred and violence will not lead us to understanding. Let's take a step towards each other." The guy with the tattoos looked at him, and doubt flashed in his eyes. Edward felt that everything depended on him now. "If we do this together, we have a chance to change the future," he said, trying to put all his sincerity into his words. Voices of agreement began to be heard in the crowd, and Edward saw some of them begin to relax. Hope seemed to be rekindled. But at that moment a new cry was heard. "If you want change, let's do it right now," one of the boys' supporters shouted. "We have to show that we are not afraid." Edward felt the tension in the air again. He knew that if he couldn't stop this impulse, things could end badly. "We can show that we are not afraid," he said, trying to maintain control. but only peacefully. Hatred will not solve anything. The guy with the tattoos looked at him, and it was clear in his eyes that he was still struggling with his own emotions. "Do you really believe what you're saying?" he asked, his voice unsure. Edward realized that this was their chance. "I believe in us. I believe that if we act together, we can create a world where everyone is heard." The crowd froze, and in that moment, Edward knew their fate hung in the balance. Could he convince everyone that they could change their reality, or would hatred reign once again? Edward stood on the stage, his heart pounding so loudly that it seemed like everyone around him could hear it. A crowd had gathered beneath him, and he could feel the gaze of hundreds of people on him, some waiting for an answer, some full of distrust, and some looking for hope. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice shaking but trying to sound confident. "We are here to talk and listen to each other. It is important that each of us expresses his or her opinion." The crowd gradually quieted down, and Edward noticed some people starting to whisper among themselves. He continued, looking into the eyes of those gathered. "I know many of us are hurting and dissatisfied, but hatred and prejudice will not lead us to a solution. We can create a new space for understanding, where everyone is heard." The first applause broke out among the crowd, and Edward felt hope ignite in his chest. People began to rise, sharing their stories. The first to come out was a young man with a short haircut, his voice trembling with excitement. "I grew up in this neighborhood and I always felt misunderstood," he began. "I was made fun of for who I was. I came here because I hope we can change that." Edward saw his words finding an echo. People began to nod, and some even wiped away tears. But at that moment, a man emerged from the crowd, clearly in an aggressive mood. "Why should we listen to your complaints?" he shouted, his face contorted with anger. "We're all here to lead a real life, not to complain about our problems." Edward felt his heart beat faster. He knew this moment could be a turning point. "We're not just complaining," he said, trying to remain calm. "We're here to learn from each other. Our goal is to understand, not to divide." The man with the aggressive expression did not calm down, and the crowd began to buzz again, dividing into two parts. Some supported Edward, others the aggressor. "If you want change, you must be prepared to act, not just talk," he shouted, and his words caused a wave of approval from his supporters. Edward knew it was important to maintain control of the situation now. He looked at Liam, who stood next to him, ready to support him. "Let's not let hate divide us," Edward shouted, his voice a call for unity. "Each of us can make a difference." The crowd fell silent again, and Edward noticed that some of them were starting to calm down. People were starting to talk, and Edward saw hope gleam in their eyes. "We can create an initiative where everyone can share their story," he continued. "It can help us understand what we're going through and maybe even find common ground." Liam nodded, supporting his words. "If we come together, we can create a real movement that will change our community," he added. "This is our chance." Finally, someone from the crowd shouted, "I'm ready to try. Let's act together." Edward felt the tension begin to ease, and hope flared in his heart. This was the first step toward true unity, but he knew there would be trials ahead. How they would cope with conflict and hatred was still in question. Edward understood that much depended on their next step. Every choice, every word could be decisive. Now their job was to come together and show that they could do more. The excitement washed over him again, but he felt that this moment was an important milestone in their journey to change. The event took place in a park where the fresh air mixed with notes of hope and expectation. Edward stood on the stage, watching the people who had gathered. Each of them came with different stories, but they were united by a common goal: to create a better future for their community. "Thank you for coming," he said, trying not to show his excitement. The crowd's attention was pressing on him, but he knew this moment was important. "We are here to talk and listen to each other. Each of you has the right to speak." A deep silence fell, and Edward noticed that some of the participants were beginning to whisper. He sensed that there was much at stake, and that every move they made would matter. The first to come out was a young man with a short haircut, his voice trembling with excitement. "I grew up in this neighborhood, and I always felt misunderstood," he began, his eyes shining with sincerity. "I came here because I hope we can change that. We have to learn from each other, or nothing will work." The crowd listened attentively, and Edward saw some nod, and even wipe away a tear. At that moment, he realized that their efforts were beginning to bear fruit. The next person to approach the microphone was a middle-aged woman, her face set in determination. "My son faced bias at school," she said, her voice full of pain. "I hope he can grow up in a world where he is not judged by the color of his skin. We must do everything we can to prevent this from happening." There were murmurs of approval from the participants, and Edward felt something more than just a conversation being created between them. It was a community united by a common goal. But at that moment, one of the aggressive supporters, the same man who had raised his voice earlier, stepped forward, his face distorted with anger. "Why should we listen to your complaints?" he shouted, his words echoing through the crowd. "We're all here to lead a real life, not to complain about our problems." Edward froze, his heart beating faster. He knew this moment could be a turning point. Liam, standing next to him, stepped forward, his expression determined. "If you're not ready to listen, then get out," he shouted, his voice full of confidence. "We're here to share experiences, not to quarrel." The negative voices began to flare up and the crowd was once again divided into two parts. Some supported Edward and Liam, while others approved of the aggressive man. Edward knew it was important not to lose control of the situation now. He looked at the assembled group and said, "Let's not let hatred divide us. Each of us can make a choice to open up or remain in the shadow of prejudice." Some of the crowd began to exchange glances, and Edward felt the atmosphere begin to change. People began to talk, and he saw a spark of hope light up in their eyes. "Let's create an initiative where everyone can share their story," he suggested, his voice confident. "It might help us understand what we're going through, and maybe even find common ground." Liam encouraged him. "If we come together, we can create a real movement that will change our community," he added. "This is our chance." Then someone from the crowd shouted, "I'm ready to try. I want to contribute." Edward felt the tension begin to ease, and hope began to burn in his heart. This was the first step toward true unity, but he knew that there would be trials ahead, and they must be prepared for new challenges. As the event came to an end, Edward remained on stage, watching the people leave. Every step they had taken today was important, but in his heart, there was a worry. How would they cope with those who did not share their aspirations? As Edward gathered his thoughts, he realized that they had to be united to deal with what was to come. With each new meeting, they laid the foundations for change, but with each step toward change, hatred and mistrust still loomed on the horizon. Edward knew their efforts were just beginning. Now they needed to focus on building connections, strengthening the community, and preparing for what was to come. The day of the meeting arrived, and Edward woke up with a feeling of trepidation in his chest. He knew there was a lot at stake, the possibility of change and the creation of a new space for dialogue. But with each new step, the weight of responsibility on his shoulders grew. The park area was decorated with posters that read, "We are one," and "Listen to understand." People began to gather, and Edward felt an air of anticipation. He hoped that everyone who came would be willing to open up and listen to each other. As Edward looked at the crowd, he noticed that there were some who did not support their ideals. At the back of the crowd stood the same man who had spoken out aggressively at the previous event. His presence made Edward uneasy. "How are you feeling?" Liam asked, walking up to him. His face was focused, but there was concern in his eyes. "I feel like we're on the brink of something big, but that shadow," Edward pointed at the man, "he could spark a conflict." Liam nodded, his face becoming even more serious. "We need to be prepared. If they decide to act, we need to have a plan to prevent violence from escalating." Edward took a deep breath, realizing he needed to maintain control of the situation. He raised his hands, calling for attention. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "We are here to talk and listen. Let's create a space where everyone can speak up without fear of judgment." There were cheers from the crowd and Edward felt the atmosphere begin to change. He continued to speak about the importance of unity and the need for open dialogue. But as soon as he finished, the man from the crowd stood up again. "This is all nonsense," he shouted. "You want change? But what are you going to do when nothing changes? You've just been wasting your time." There were muffled voices of discontent at his words, and the tension in the crowd became palpable. Edward knew that if he did not calm the situation, everything could get out of control. "Let's not give in to aggression," he said, trying to sound confident. "We're here to build bridges, not walls. Each of us has a voice." The crowd froze in anticipation. and Edward noticed some of them start to exchange glances. Liam stepped forward again, his voice firm. "Let's focus on what unites us, not what divides us," he added. "We all want peace and understanding," but the aggressive man was not going to back down. "You just want to get rid of the truth. This idealistic notion of yours won't work." His words resonated with part of the crowd, and the tension rose again. Edward felt fear creeping up on him. He knew he had to maintain a peaceful approach, but he couldn't ignore the tense atmosphere. "We don't run from the truth," he said, trying to remain calm. "We accept it and learn from our mistakes, but if we don't open up to each other, how can we move forward?" There were whispers and discussions among the crowd, but hatred was still in the air. Edward suddenly noticed how some of his supporters began to doubt, looking at each other. "This is our chance to show that we can be more than just a group of people," he said, raising his voice to cut through the din. "We can be a movement that changes this place." Then another cry came from the support. "I'm ready to try. I want to contribute." Edward saw some people start to rise and nod, and this gave him confidence. But at that moment the aggressive man exclaimed, "You are all just weaklings. Do you think you can change anything?" Edward felt his heart beat faster. He knew this could be the turning point. He looked at Liam, who was standing next to him, and saw the support in his eyes. "Let's not let hatred take over," Edward said to everyone. "We must stay together, even if it's difficult." The crowd froze in anticipation. Edward felt the hesitation and indecision begin to disappear. People began to whisper among themselves, and hope flared up in his heart. Having collected his thoughts, he said, "Let's have a meeting next week. Let everyone prepare their ideas, and we can discuss them together." There were cheers from the crowd, and Edward knew this could be the beginning of a real movement, but there was still a hint of aggression in the air, and he knew there would be trials ahead. As the meeting came to an end, Edward remained on the stage, watching the dispersed crowd disperse. The atmosphere was tense, and anxiety lingered in his heart. He knew that their efforts to unite the community could cause a backlash from those who did not share their ideals. As he approached Liam, he noticed that he was focused and slightly worried. "How are you feeling?" Edward asked. "It's fine, but..." Liam pointed to a group of disgruntled people standing to the side. "I don't think this is the end. They're clearly up to something." Jake approached them. His face was distorted with anger, and his eyes glowed with fury. "What are you doing here?" he shouted, stepping forward. "You think you can change everything in this city? It's your illusion." Edward felt tension creep up on him. He knew Jake's words were filled with hatred, but there was also confusion in them. "We are here to speak and listen," he said, trying to remain calm. "We want to build a society where everyone is heard." "Build a society?" Jake sneered, his laugh filled with utter contempt. "You're just a group of lunatics who don't know what they want. You can't stop what's happening." But Edward heard a note of doubt in his voice. Perhaps the seeds of realization were already beginning to grow within him. "We can and must change this," Liam said, trying to get Jake's attention. "But if you're not willing to listen, how can we even begin a dialogue?" Jake hesitated, his eyes wavering between anger and confusion. He took a step back, as if realizing that his words might lead to more aggression. "You don't even understand what you're dealing with, boy," he shouted, but there was no longer the same confidence in his voice. "You're destroying everything we've built." Edward felt fear creeping up on him, but he knew he had to stay strong. "We're not against the community," he said, trying to sound confident. "We're against hate and prejudice. We're here to work for change." Jake gritted his teeth, the tension visible. He was clearly struggling with his inner demons. "If you don't stop, I'll..." he began, but his voice weakened. He paused, and in that moment Edward saw Jake begin to realize that his actions could lead to even more serious consequences. "I'm not going to hide," Edward said, raising his hands to calm the situation. "We just want to talk, and this is important for all of us." At that moment, Jake froze. He looked at Edward, and there was something more than just hatred in his eyes. It was a realization and understanding that his hatred would not solve the problems. It would only make them worse. "You will still regret your words," he said, but his voice was not so confident. He turned and walked away, his steps becoming less sure, as if he was beginning to realize that the hatred he carried was not bringing peace or resolution. As they left, Edward and Liam exchanged worried glances. "This is just the beginning," Edward said, his voice low. "We must be prepared for them to try to stop us." "Yeah," Liam agreed, but I feel like Jake's not so sure about his actions anymore. This could be our opportunity." Knowing that there were many difficulties ahead, Edward felt his resolve grow. He knew that their efforts to create dialogue had to continue, despite the threats and hatred they faced. But deep down, he hoped that Jake would see the truth and change his mind. The day of the meeting arrived and tension hung in the air like fog. Edward gathered his team at the local center where they planned the discussion. With each passing minute, the number of supporters grew and the atmosphere became more and more tense. "We need to be prepared," Edward said, looking around at the assembled group. "A lot can happen today. We need to remember why we're here. Our goal is dialogue, not conflict." Liam nodded, but there was worry in his eyes. "I heard that Jake and his group are planning to come. I'm not sure they're ready to talk." Edward felt a growing sense of unease. He knew that the confrontation could escalate into something more serious if patience was not shown on both sides. "Let's just be prepared for the fact that they may try to provoke us," Edward said, "but we won't give in. If they start threatening, we must be calm and show that hatred will lead to nothing good." At that moment, a group of people entered the room, and the crowd froze. Jake stood in front, his face twisted in malice, his eyes glowing with rage. His approach created tension, and Edward felt the air grow thicker. "You think you can just come in here and change everything?" Jake shouted to the crowd. "This isn't your territory." Edward, not wanting to make the situation worse, stepped forward. "We're here to talk, Jake. We're not looking for conflict," he said, trying to sound calm. "We want to discuss how we can build a better future." Jake chuckled, his laugh filled with complete disdain. "Build a future? With these people?" He pointed at Edward and Liam, his face red with rage. "You're all just a bunch of naive dreamers." The crowd froze, and confusion appeared on some people's faces. Edward knew that it was important to show restraint now. "We're all here because we want change. We want to be heard," he said, trying to sound confident, but hatred and fear only destroy. Jake continued to persist. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. We can't let you destroy our community." At that moment, Liam stepped forward, his voice full of determination. "But it is hatred that is tearing our community apart. We do not want war. We want peace. We are here to try to understand each other." Jake hesitated, but the hatred was still seething in his eyes. He bit his lip, and Edward noticed the internal conflict growing within him. At one point, Jake looked away, as if trying to comprehend what was happening. "You think you can change everything with just words?" he said, but his voice no longer sounded so confident. "It's all too simple." Edward saw that others in the crowd began to discuss among themselves, and this gave him confidence. "Change doesn't come easy, Jake, but if we keep sharing hate, nothing will change," he said. "We all want a better future. Let's try to find common ground." These words seemed to hurt Jake. He began to waver, his anger gradually giving way to doubt. He began, but couldn't finish the sentence. A spark of understanding appeared in his eyes, and it seemed he was beginning to realize that hatred would lead to nothing good. The crowd froze in anticipation. Edward and Liam exchanged glances, realizing that this could be the turning point. "Jake," Edward said, "let's try to understand each other. Together we can create something more than just a fight." There was hope in that moment of silence in the air. Edward believed that they could achieve something more if they gave each other a chance. The sky was covered with gray clouds as Edward and his team prepared for their next meeting. There was tension in the air, and everyone felt that this could be a defining moment in their fight for change. Edward gathered everyone at the local center, where they discussed how to prepare for a possible confrontation with Jake and his supporters. "We need to be prepared," Edward began, looking into the faces of his friends and associates. "We don't know how they will react to our calls for dialogue, but we must show that hatred will not solve the problem." Liam nodded, but his expression betrayed concern. "I have a bad feeling about this. Jake is not one to back down easily," he said. "If they decide to act aggressively, we need to be prepared for the consequences." A group of activists joined them, each expressing a willingness to defend their beliefs. Edward felt the determination in the room growing, but at the same time he knew they would have to be careful. He remembered the last time Jake had spoken words of hatred, and the thought troubled him. At the meeting, the participants discussed a plan of action in case the situation got out of control. Edward emphasized the importance of remaining calm, even if Jake decided to start a conflict. We must not respond to hate with hate. Our strength lies in our unity and our message, he said. Meanwhile, Jake stood on the street corner, watching his opponents gather in the center. Conflicting feelings stirred in his heart. He felt fear and anger, but at the same time, doubts arose in his mind. Are you going to fight them? One of his friends asked, noticing that Jake looked thoughtful. I don't know, Jake said, his voice dejected. Maybe this isn't it. Maybe we should talk to them. Are you crazy? His comrade exclaimed. They only want to destroy our community. Jake's internal conflict was growing. He couldn't get rid of the thought that hatred couldn't be the solution. Maybe his actions would only make things worse, and it was no longer allowing him to sleep peacefully. When the meeting began, Edward and his team were standing on the stage, ready to address the crowd. He saw that Jake's group had arrived as well, and it made his heart beat faster. We are here today to talk, Edward began, trying to sound confident. We must find common ground to create a better future for all. But Jake stepped forward, and his voice filled the room again. You think you can just come here and change everything? This is not your territory, he shouted, reminding everyone of his aggressive stance. Edward tried to remain calm. We are not here to destroy, but to create, he said. We must work together to get rid of the hatred that divides us. Jake looked at the crowd, hesitating. He saw that his words were not getting the reaction he was hoping for. Suddenly he realized that hatred would not give him the answer he was looking for. He began, but then froze. Confusion appeared in his eyes. Perhaps, deep down, he was beginning to understand that his actions were only leading to greater division. Edward saw this and continued. Jake, we can create something greater than fighting. Let's try to find common ground. Our strength is in understanding and unity. Edward's words began to penetrate into the hearts of the people, and the atmosphere of the meeting became tense. Jake may have finally begun to realize that hatred and fear only fuel conflicts. The sun was slowly rising above the horizon, penetrating the gray clouds. In the center of the city, people were gathered, waiting for the meeting to continue. Edward could feel the anticipation in the air. This was the moment when everything could change. Jake stood among his supporters, but this time his face expressed something different, not confidence and hatred, but deep thought. His heart wavered between the old and the new. When Edward walked onto the stage, he saw Jake standing to the side, looking at him thoughtfully. This was unexpected. Edward collected his thoughts and, turning to everyone, said, Today we are here to build a bridge between our communities. We all face challenges, and only together can we find a solution. The crowd froze in anticipation. Some began to whisper, and the tension in the air became palpable. What I'm saying is that we're willing to listen, Edward continued. Hate and fear only destroy, but if we're open and honest, we can find common ground. Jake stepped forward. Edward's heart began to beat faster. He didn't know what to expect. Jake began, his voice shaking, but he continued. I was blinded by hatred. I thought it was the only way to protect what I had, but I see that it doesn't solve the problem. I see that it only deepens the divide. People in the crowd began to whisper, surprised by the change in his mood. Edward saw some of his opponents begin to process his words. It was a moment of hope. I'm sorry for all the words and actions that caused pain, Jake said, his voice growing firmer. I want us to work together. We can create something better if we're open to change. The crowd froze. Edward felt hope begin to rise in his heart. He knew that this was not the end, but the beginning of something new. Jake, he said, your words matter. We can work together to change our community. We can overcome hate and build bridges instead of walls. Gradually, the group standing with Jake began to applaud. It was an unexpected but meaningful gesture. People began to exchange glances, and even among the opponents, smiles began to appear on faces. We can't just forget what happened, Edward continued, but we can learn from our mistakes and move forward. At that moment, the sun broke through the clouds and its rays illuminated everyone gathered in the center. It was symbolic, as if nature supported their desire for change. Let's create a new community together, based on respect and understanding, Edward said, his voice filled with hope. People started applauding, and it was the beginning of a new journey. Edward felt like a miracle was happening before his eyes when hatred gave way to understanding, and fear was replaced by hope. Jake was also undergoing a transformation within himself. He was beginning to realize that change was possible if they were each willing to take a step toward each other. This was his chance to change his life and the lives of others. This meeting marked the beginning of a new journey for both communities. Together they decided to work on projects that would help bring people together, create cultural events, and provide support for those who suffer from the effects of hate and bias. Jake and Edward's story became a symbol of the possibility of change that can emerge even in the darkest corners. People began to realize that despite their differences, they all wanted the same thing: to be heard and to live in peace. The assembled group, full of hope and determination, began to discuss plans for the future, and at that moment it became clear that their common story was just beginning. The story ended on a positive note, opening the way for change and understanding. Jake and Edward became symbols of hope, showing that even the deepest differences can be overcome if they come to dialogue. Their example inspired other communities, and together they began to create a brighter future. This new chapter in their lives was the beginning of a long journey toward healing and unity, where hatred gave way to love and understanding. And that was the real miracle, the power of change that lives within each of us. Thank you for being with us throughout this story. We are very interested to know your opinion. What do you think about what happened to Jake and Edward? Have you had any experiences in your life related to racism? You are very important to us, and we appreciate each of you. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it. Have a great day!